started to investigate a phenomenon which was occurring on these big new fighters. This was loss of control and a very considerable buffeting and roughness that was experienced when they were diving these airplanes high up. It wasn't happening low down, but if they tried to get these airplanes to dive to their limiting speeds at high altitude, they were running into control difficulties.
Aerodynamics specialists working at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough had come to believe that the cause of this phenomenon was a change in flow characteristics over the aircraft's surfaces due to the air becoming compressed as it approached the speed of sound. Quite simply, in the thin air at high altitude, the aerodynamics of the aircraft were preventing it from going any faster. As the aircraft reached the thicker air at around 10,000 feet, the pilots were able to regain control. By 1942, the terms supersonic and compressibility were beginning to be used in discussions about these incidents. A new and apparently impenetrable limit had been reached, and fighters were now dived to their compressibility limit as part of their test program.
We at Hawkers were investigating why, and we did find during that period, and had established by about mid-1943, that if you got into this frightening lack of control, right into the point where you were actually out of control, and it was rolling and diving away from you, despite everything you could do with it, if you stayed there and rode it down from 15,000 feet or so down to about 10,000 feet, the speed of the aircraft relative to the speed of sound as you got into the thicker air reduced. And as that occurred, the shock waves died down and control came back. And so this was known as compressibility. It was a recognized condition by the end of 43, and the designers were very, very busy trying to design the next generation of airplanes which would overcome this problem. But until they did, and it really wasn't until after the war that we got airplanes that would actually cope and get right through this condition, compressibility was a limitation which all the air forces had to observe, and pilots had to be trained to avoid getting into it.
Raising the point of compressibility was only one part of the problem. The other was designing an engine powerful enough to fly even faster. Piston engines had virtually reached the limits of their potential, and so in 1942, British officials began to take a new interest in a concept dismissed by them some years earlier: Frank Whittle's jet engine. Meanwhile, but what came as a shock to the pilots flying fighters like the Mustang and late Mark Spitfires escorting the bombers was the sheer speed of the ME-262. Not only was it nearly 100 miles an hour faster, it could dive significantly faster. The swept wings and jet power of the ME-262 showed that military aviation had reached a new threshold.
With relevance to the swept wing was the very high Mach number that could be achieved with it in control, as opposed to any of the Allied aircraft flying at that time. I mean, it was a huge gap, a quantum jump, really.
The Germans set about their research in a way which was very effective, and by the middle of the war they were advanced very considerably in terms of aerodynamics and high speed, and they had produced a number of experimental aircraft which would get very, very close to the speed of sound. The first one that was of practical value was the Messerschmitt 262, which was a twin-engine fighter. That in 1943 was streets ahead of anything that the Allies.
And so the period immediately following the Second World War was one of change and excitement in aviation. The Allies lost no time in scrutinizing German research data on transonic aerodynamics. But the race to go supersonic was all but over, even before Chuck Yeager began his historic mission. The British government had cancelled the Miles M52, a research project.
I can only say we were
AF soldiered on with its Meteors and de Havilland Vampires, which had come into operational service in 1946. Despite its outdated design, the Meteor went on to set the world speed record in 1946 of 606 miles per hour. However, it was becoming clear that the West faced a new threat to peace from Soviet Russia and her satellites in Eastern Europe. Russia had been massively hurt by the war, and its leaders and people never wanted to have such pain inflicted on it again. For this reason, she began a program of rapid modernization of her armed forces. In particular, the Air Force benefited greatly from help given to her by her former allies. B-29 bombers, formerly belonging to the US Air Force, provided the basis for a new long-range bomber force. Then Britain provided the Soviets with a batch of Rolls-Royce jet engines. Soon, the Russians had a transonic jet fighter of their own, the MiG-15. Peta. The Canberra had been specified as a replacement for the Mosquito. However, it became clear during the design process that this aircraft would have superior performance to all of the RAF's current fighters. It was capable of flying at 55,000 feet, at almost 600 miles per hour, well beyond the range of any interceptors. Achieved a turnaround of opinion in Whitehall, and the go-ahead was given for a design study for a fully supersonic fighter, the P-1.
In the discussions in 1948 about
A period between 1949 and 1953, against a background of hazardous research into supersonic flight. Ability to maintain a speed just below the speed of sound in level flight. By 1954, Hunters were replacing the North American Sabres as the RAF's frontline interceptor. Whilst these aircraft could, on occasions, pierce the sound barrier in a dive, it had become clear that this era of fighters with relatively thick wings swept at 45 degrees and high tailplanes would not produce a truly supersonic fighter.
it. I think the Sabre, which was a very fine subsonic fighter, and the
One above the other. However, in order to avoid too much engine weight aft, the lower engine was located well forward of the upper. This layout meant that the P-1 had twice the thrust of a single engine with only around 1.5 times the frontal area. Unlike any aircraft flying at the time, it had a radical shoulder-mounted wing, swept to 60 degrees. These wings were incredibly thin, but immensely strong. Finally, the configuration was completed with a thin, all-moving tailplane mounted at the bottom of the rear fuselage. The RAE favoured a high position, as it was assumed that this provided
view, I cut